Starting the microwave is as easy as turning the top dial to the desired time and away it goes. You stop it again by opening the door or turning the dial to the left.
The Suavecito, what is it called? The biker chain wallet. Definitely recommend it.
The 1980s were loud, bright, and unforgettable, but let's be honest, they were also completely insane. From shoulder pads that needed their own zip code to hair that could survive nuclear winter, it all felt normal back then. But today, you'll wonder how we kept straight faces. Microwaving everything. Let's start with something that still makes absolutely no sense. Our complete and utter faith in the microwave. This wasn't just a machine for reheating leftovers. Oh no, we genuinely believed this magical radiation box was the future of all cooking. Scrambled eggs? Microwave. Sunday roast? Microwave. Birthday cake? You bet your neon leg warmers we microwaved that too. We had entire cookbooks dedicated to microwave cuisine, as if zapping food with electromagnetic waves was some kind of sophisticated culinary art. The results were always interesting. Everything had the same rubbery, slightly warm, but somehow still cold texture, like it had been processed through some kind of space-age food laboratory. Vegetables turned into mushy, colorless versions of themselves. Meat became chewy and gray. Even scrambled eggs somehow managed to be both dried out and soggy at the same time. But did we care about texture? Did we question whether maybe, just maybe, there was a reason traditional cooking methods had existed for thousands of years? Absolutely not. We cared about speed and convenience. We were busy, important people living in the future and standing over a stove like our grandmothers was for chumps. The microwave was progress, efficiency, modernity, wrapped up in a beige box that hummed and beeped at us. We'd gather around this culinary marvel like it was performing magic tricks. The turntable would slowly rotate our sad attempts at gourmet cooking while we peered through that little window, watching our food spin like it was on some kind of bizarre merry-go-round. And when that timer dinged, we'd act like we'd just witnessed the pinnacle of human achievement. "Dinner's ready," we'd announce proudly, as if we'd spent hours crafting something magnificent instead of nuking it into submission in 3 minutes. Cabbage Patch craziness, but our questionable relationship with technology was nothing compared to our complete obsession with adoption papers for fabric babies. Yes, you heard that right. We were literally fighting in toy store aisles over dolls that came with birth certificates and adoption documentation. The Cabbage Patch Kids weren't just toys, they were full-blown family members with legal paperwork. These weren't even particularly attractive dolls. They looked like lumpy, soft sculpture creatures that had been designed by someone who had only heard dolls described secondhand. Their faces were squishy and asymmetrical. Their hair was made of yarn that felt like steel wool, and their bodies were basically stuffed pillowcases with arms and legs, but somehow this made them more real to us. The riots were absolutely real. Black Friday stampedes had nothing on desperate parents trying to secure a Cabbage Patch Kid for Christmas. Grown adults would throw actual punches over these fabric babies. Store managers would have to call security. People would camp out overnight, create elaborate schemes, and form underground networks just to get their hands on one of these adoption-ready dolls. And we treated this like it was completely normal consumer behavior. Oh, did you hear about the fight at Toys R Us? 3 people hospitalized over a Cabbage Patch Kid. We'd nod knowingly, like this was just another Tuesday in the sophisticated world of 1980s parenting. The idea that maybe, possibly, we were taking doll ownership a little too seriously never crossed our minds. The adoption ceremony was serious business, too. You didn't just buy a Cabbage Patch Kid. You adopted one. You had to recite an oath, sign papers, and promise to love and care for your new fabric child. Parents would help their actual human children fill out adoption certificates for their new doll siblings. It was like some kind of alternate reality where toys required legal guardianship. TV Antenna Ballet. Meanwhile, our entertainment required a level of physical coordination that would make Olympic athletes proud. Remember the TV Antenna Ballet? You'd be settling in to watch your favorite show when the picture would start doing that horizontal roll thing, or everything would dissolve into a snowstorm of static. This wasn't a rare occurrence. This was Tuesday night television. So naturally, one sibling would have to become a human antenna holder while the other became the director of this elaborate performance. Move left. No, your other left. Tilt it toward the window. Hold it right there. Don't move a muscle. Meanwhile, the other sibling would be planted in front of the TV like a statue, shouting directions like an air traffic controller, guiding planes through a storm. We'd spend 20 minutes trying to get 3 channels to come in clearly, and somehow this felt perfectly reasonable. The antenna holder would develop arm cramps, leg cramps, and a permanent slouch from maintaining impossible positions. "If you move, we lose, NBC," was a genuine threat that could keep a kid frozen in place for an entire evening. And God help you if you had to sneeze or scratch an itch while holding the antenna. The delicate balance of aluminum rods and electromagnetic waves was more fragile than a house of cards in a hurricane. One tiny movement, and suddenly everyone's favorite show looked like it was being broadcast from Mars during a solar flare. But we accepted this as the price of entertainment. We didn't complain about having to perform contortionist acts just to watch television. We didn't question whether maybe there was a better way to receive television signals. We just assigned antenna duty like it was a legitimate household chore and got on with our lives. Scented markers. Speaking of things we never questioned, let's talk about our habit of literally sniffing our homework supplies. Scented markers weren't just writing utensils. They were aromatic experiences that we inhaled with the dedication of wine connoisseurs. Cherry red, grape purple, orange, strawberry pink. We knew every scent by heart and had our personal favorites. Teachers would hand out worksheets and half the class would immediately start huffing their markers like they were sampling perfume at a department store. We'd uncap them, take a deep whiff, and sigh contentedly before even thinking about actually writing anything. This smells like blueberries," we'd announce to anyone within earshot, as if we were conducting a sophisticated fragrance review. Nobody thought this was weird. Nobody questioned whether maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't be encouraging children to sniff chemical-based products designed for writing. Parents would buy us entire rainbow sets of these scented markers, and we'd organize them by smell preference rather than color coordination. The more potent the scent, the more prized the marker. We'd trade them like currency. "I'll give you my grape and my strawberry for your root beer and your mint." Serious negotiations would take place over marker exchanges, with kids carefully sniffing each potential trade to ensure they were getting the best aromatic value for their investment, and the ritual of using them was elaborate. You didn't just grab a scented marker and start writing. You had to appreciate the bouquet first. Uncap, sniff, smile, maybe take a second sniff for good measure, and then begin your assignment. By the time we actually started writing, half the class was probably slightly lightheaded from marker fumes, but we called it being creative. Garbage Pail Kids cards. But our strangest collecting obsession had to be our dedication to deliberately disgusting trading cards that made parents everywhere question their parenting choices. Garbage Pail Kids weren't just trading cards. They were wonderfully revolting pieces of art that we collected with the seriousness of museum curators building priceless collections. Dead Ted, Nasty Nick, Blasted Billy, Potty Scotty. We knew every gross-out character by name and could recite their disgusting backstories from memory. These cards featured artwork that was specifically designed to be as revolting as possible, and we absolutely loved them for it. The more nauseating, the better. If a card didn't make at least one adult gag, it wasn't worth having. Parents would find these cards hidden in our backpacks and react like we'd brought home actual biological hazards. "Where did you get these horrible things?" they'd demand, holding the cards at arm's length like they might be contagious, but their disgust just made us love them more. We were rebels with a cause, and that cause was collecting the most wonderfully awful cards ever created. The trading was serious business. Kids would gather in secret corners of the playground, carefully examining each other's collections like underground art dealers. "I've got 3 booger bills and a nasty nick. What'll you give me for a dead Ted?" These weren't just cards. They were currency in an economy based entirely on grossness. We'd study the artwork with the intensity of art historians, appreciating the creative ways the artists had imagined each character's disgusting demise or revolting hobby. The more detailed the grossness, the more valuable the card. We were connoisseurs of disgusting, and we wore that title with pride. Pet rocks. But perhaps the most baffling purchase decision of our entire generation was our willingness to spend actual money on rocks. Not precious stones, not crystals with supposed healing properties, not even decorative rocks for landscaping, just regular rocks from the ground that we bought with money for companionship. The pet rock phenomenon wasn't just a brief moment of collective madness. It was a cultural movement that somehow convinced millions of people that what their lives were missing was a sedentary, non-responsive, completely inanimate companion. We'd go to stores, browse through displays of rocks like we were selecting puppies, and carefully choose the perfect stone to take home and care for. And we did care for them. We'd give them names, create little beds for them, talk to them about our day. "How was your day, Rocky?" "Mine was exhausting, but I bet you had a nice, peaceful time just sitting there being a rock." We'd introduce them to friends like they were actual pets. "This is my pet rock, Stanley. He's very low maintenance." The instruction manual that came with each pet rock was somehow both completely serious and utterly ridiculous. It included detailed care instructions for an object that required no care whatsoever. "Your pet rock is naturally house-trained," it would inform us, as if this was a remarkable feature rather than the obvious result of being an inanimate object incapable of bodily functions. We'd carry them around in little carriers, take them on family vacations, and genuinely worry about their well-being if we left them alone too long. Parents would catch us having full conversations with our rocks and somehow conclude that this was normal, healthy behavior. "Oh, little Susie is playing with her pet rock again. Isn't that sweet?" The marketing genius was that they convinced us we were getting a pet without any of the responsibilities of actual pet ownership. No feeding, no walking, no cleaning up messes, no veterinary bills. Just pure, uncomplicated companionship from a chunk of stone that would never disappoint us, never run away, and never die. Looking back, it was either the most honest pet ownership experience ever or the most elaborate practical joke played on an entire generation. Phone cords across the room. Meanwhile, our quest for privacy required the engineering skills of a telecommunications expert and the flexibility of a contortionist. Remember those phone cords that seemed to stretch across entire continents? When you needed to have a private conversation, you didn't just pick up the phone and walk away. You embarked on an elaborate journey that involved dragging 20 feet of coiled cord under doors, around furniture, and through the labyrinthine layout of your house. The phone was permanently attached to the kitchen wall, but your need for privacy was in your bedroom upstairs. So began the great cord migration. You'd stretch that spiral cord to its absolute limit, creating a complex pathway that turned your house into an obstacle course for anyone trying to navigate around your conversation route. Family members would have to duck under the cord, step over it, or perform elaborate limbo maneuvers just to move through their own home. "Excuse me, can you lift the phone cord? I need to get to the refrigerator." This was a legitimate request that required careful coordination between the phone user and anyone trying to live their life in the same house. The cord would get twisted into impossible knots that required advanced engineering to untangle. You'd spend 10 minutes before each phone call just trying to unwind the spiral cord enough to reach your desired privacy location. By the time you'd successfully navigated the cord to your secret conversation spot, you'd forgotten half of what you wanted to say. And God help you if someone else needed to use the phone while you were in the middle of your cross-house communications setup. "I need to call Dad at work," someone would shout, and you'd have to carefully retrace your steps, rewinding the cord like you were defusing a bomb, making sure not to disconnect your call in the process. The really dedicated privacy seekers would stretch that cord so far that the phone conversation would start to sound like you were calling from another planet. The connection would get weaker and weaker as the cord reached its maximum extension, but we'd rather have a barely audible conversation than risk our parents overhearing us discuss the drama from math class. Trapper Keeper's obsession. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, was as serious as our relationship with our trapper keepers. These weren't just school supplies. They were sacred vessels that contained our entire academic and social lives. We guarded them with the intensity of security guards protecting national treasures, and we customized them with the dedication of artists creating masterpieces. The selection process was lengthy and crucial. You didn't just grab any trapper keeper off the shelf. You had to find the one that spoke to your soul. Was it the geometric patterns that screamed, "I'm sophisticated and mathematical"? The neon colors that announced, "I'm bold and confident"? The sports themes that declared, "I'm athletic and popular"? This decision would define your entire school year personality. Once you'd chosen your trapper keeper, the customization began. Stickers weren't just decorations. They were personal statements, territorial markers, and social currency all rolled into one. We'd spend hours carefully arranging and rearranging our sticker collections, creating elaborate designs that told the story of our interests, our friendships, and our aspirations. The satisfying snap of those metal rings closing was like sealing a vault. That sound meant your precious papers, your important notes, and your secret past notes were secure. We'd practice opening and closing them just to hear that metallic click that announced to the world that we were organized, prepared, and slightly obsessed with office supplies. And the organization system inside was elaborate beyond reason. Color-coded folders, carefully labeled sections, plastic pouches for pencils that were arranged by size and color. We'd spend more time organizing our trapper keepers than we did actually studying from them. The act of organizing was somehow more important than the actual organization. Teachers would recognize the telltale signs of trapper-keeper addiction. Students who spent more time arranging their supplies than paying attention to lessons, who could locate any piece of paper in their binder faster than a librarian could find a book, and who treated their trapper-keepers like they contained state secrets rather than math homework. Chain wallets and neon everything. Speaking of questionable life choices, let's talk about our decision to attach our wallets to our bodies with actual chains, while simultaneously dressing like we'd fallen into a vat of highlighter ink. Chain wallets weren't just accessories, they were statements that said, "I'm so rebellious that I don't trust myself not to lose my wallet, so I've literally chained it to my body." These weren't delicate jewelry chains either. We're talking about heavy-duty metal chains that could probably tow a small car. They'd hang from our belt loops, clanking against our legs with every step, creating a percussion section wherever we walked. The sound of a group of teenagers with chain wallets walking down a hallway was like listening to a marching band having a breakdown. But the chains were nothing compared to our commitment to neon everything. We didn't just wear bright colors. We wore colors that didn't exist in nature, colors that could be seen from space, colors that made traffic cones look subtle. neon pink, electric blue, radioactive green, highlighter yellow. If it hurt to look at directly, we wanted to wear it. We'd layer these colors together with the confidence of people who genuinely believed that more was always better. Neon pink shirt with electric blue jacket with highlighter yellow accessories. We looked like walking art installations, human glow sticks, living examples of what happens when fashion meets nuclear waste. The combination of chain wallets and neon everything created a generation of teenagers who were simultaneously the most visible and most audibly identifiable people on the planet. You could hear us coming from 3 blocks away and see us coming from 3 miles away. We were walking safety hazards, human traffic cones, impossible to ignore. Parents would watch us leave the house looking like we'd been dressed by a committee of colorblind people with a serious chain fetish and somehow conclude that this was just normal teenage expression. "Oh, that's just how kids dress these days," they'd say, as if we hadn't completely lost our minds and decided to become walking disco balls with extensive personal security systems. Tang as a health drink. But perhaps our most misguided health decision was our complete faith in Tang as a legitimate nutritional choice. This wasn't just a drink. This was astronaut fuel, and if it was good enough for NASA, it was certainly good enough for our growing bodies. The fact that it was basically orange-flavored sugar powder dissolved in water somehow escaped our notice entirely. Mothers across America would mix up pitchers of this artificial orange concoction and serve it to their children with the confidence of people providing essential nutrition. "Drink your Tang, sweetie. It's got vitamin C." Never mind that the vitamin C was probably added as an afterthought to justify calling it anything other than orange sugar water. We'd gulp down glasses of this stuff like it was liquid health, completely convinced that we were making responsible dietary choices. The more Tang we drank, the healthier we felt. It was bright orange, which meant it was obviously related to actual oranges, right? And if astronauts drank it in space, it must be some kind of advanced nutritional technology that regular people were just lucky to have access to. The powder itself was a marvel of artificial food engineering. It would clump together in impossible ways, creating orange rocks that required serious mixing skills to dissolve. We'd stir and stir, watching the powder slowly surrender to the water, creating a drink that was somehow both too sweet and not sweet enough at the same time. Parents would stock up on Tang like they were preparing for a nutritional apocalypse. Kitchen cabinets across America were filled with those distinctive orange containers, ready to provide instant health drinks at a moment's notice. "We're out of orange juice, but we have Tang," was considered an acceptable substitute, as if these two things were remotely related, and we never questioned it. We never wondered why our health drink came in powder form, why it was that particular shade of orange that doesn't exist in nature, or why it left an aftertaste that lingered for hours. We just accepted that Tang was part of a balanced breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and that drinking it somehow connected us to the brave astronauts exploring the cosmos. Smoky bowling alleys. But our strangest social gathering spots had to be those smoke-filled bowling alleys where we'd spend entire Saturday afternoons breathing air that was roughly 60% cigarette smoke and 40% actual oxygen. Walking into a bowling alley was like entering a fog machine convention where everyone had decided to bring their own personal smoke generators. The haze was so thick you could barely see the pins at the other end of the lane. And nobody flinched, nobody complained, nobody even seemed to notice that we were essentially playing sports inside a giant ashtray. Parents would drop their kids off for birthday parties in these smoke-filled caverns, like they were delivering them to perfectly normal, healthy recreation centers. "Have fun bowling, sweetie. Try not to inhale too much second-hand smoke," was never a sentence that was actually spoken, but it probably should have been. The ashtrays were everywhere, built into the scoring tables, mounted on the walls, sitting on every available surface like some kind of smoking shrine. People would bowl a frame, take a drag, bowl another frame, take another drag. The rhythm of the game was perfectly synchronized with cigarette consumption. Strike, puff, spare, puff, gutter ball, longer puff. We'd sit there eating nachos and pizza while surrounded by clouds of smoke, somehow convinced that this was a normal family outing. The cheese would have a slight smoky flavor, not because it was smoked cheese, but because everything in the building had been marinated in cigarette smoke for decades. Even the bowling balls smelled like an ashtray. The rental shoes were probably the most hazardous part of the experience, and not because of hygiene concerns. They were hazardous because they'd been sitting in that smoke-filled environment for so long that putting them on was like strapping tiny smoking lounges to your feet. You'd walk around leaving little puffs of residual smoke with every step, and somehow we thought this was wholesome family entertainment. Let's go bowling was considered a healthy activity suggestion. Parents would celebrate their kids' strikes while simultaneously contributing to the atmospheric pollution that made it nearly impossible to see those strikes happen. TV dinners in metal trays. Meanwhile, our relationship with convenience food had reached levels of acceptance that would make modern food safety experts weep. TV dinners weren't just meals. They were science experiments that we willingly subjected ourselves to on a regular basis. These aluminum trays of mystery food would emerge from the oven with the consistency of molten lava on the edges and Arctic ice in the center. The compartmentalized trays were like little landscape dioramas of culinary disappointment. The mashed potatoes would be bubbling like a volcanic hot spring while the green beans remained cryogenically frozen. The Salisbury steak would have a crust that could deflect bullets, while the inside stayed cool enough to preserve meat for archaeological study. This wasn't just uneven heating. This was thermal warfare. But did we send them back? Did we demand better heating technology? Did we question whether maybe, just maybe, there was a fundamental flaw in the TV dinner concept? Absolutely not. We'd carefully navigate around the molten sections, blow on the frozen parts, and eat every single bite with the dedication of people who genuinely believed this was sophisticated dining. The aluminum trays would be scorching hot to the touch, requiring elaborate juggling techniques just to transport them from oven to table. We'd develop calluses on our fingertips from handling these portable furnaces, but somehow this seemed like a reasonable price to pay for the convenience of not having to cook actual food. We'd sit in front of our televisions, balancing these thermal disasters on our laps, trying to enjoy our favorite shows while simultaneously performing complex temperature management on our dinners. Wait, let me stir the frozen peas into the lava potatoes to achieve some kind of edible middle ground. The variety was impressive in its consistency of disappointment. Fried chicken that was neither fried nor clearly chicken, beef stroganoff that contained no identifiable beef, turkey dinners that made you question what turkeys actually were. Each meal was a mystery, wrapped in aluminum foil, and we were willing participants in this culinary lottery. JellO with suspicious add-ins. But our most creative culinary adventures happened when we decided that JellO was a suitable base for literally anything we could find in the refrigerator. This wasn't just dessert. This was architectural food engineering that defied both logic and taste. If it jiggled, it was automatically considered suitable for dinner party presentation. The combinations were truly spectacular in their wrongness. Lime JellO with shredded carrots and mayonnaise, because apparently someone thought vegetables needed to be suspended in gelatinous green goo to be properly appreciated. Orange JellO with cottage cheese and pineapple chunks, creating a texture that was simultaneously creamy, chunky, and wobbly. Somehow, this passed for sophisticated entertaining. The tuna JellO mold was perhaps the pinnacle of this culinary madness. Someone, somewhere, decided that tuna fish would be improved by being trapped in a wobbly prison of artificially flavored gelatin. We'd serve these at dinner parties with the confidence of people presenting gourmet cuisine, completely oblivious to the fact that we'd created something that looked like a science experiment gone wrong. The preparation was elaborate and time-consuming. You had to plan ahead for JellO salads, carefully timing the gelatin setting process, layering ingredients at precise intervals to create those distinctive striped effects. We'd spend hours creating these gelatinous masterpieces, treating them like edible art installations that happened to contain random refrigerator contents. The unmolding process was always dramatic. You'd hold your breath while inverting the mold, hoping that your carefully constructed JellO architecture would maintain its shape and not collapse into a pile of wobbly disappointment. When it worked, you felt like an engineering genius. When it didn't, you served it anyway and called it rustic presentation. And guests would actually eat this stuff. They'd compliment your creativity, ask for the recipe, and genuinely seem to enjoy foods that had no business being combined in the first place. We'd developed an entire social dining culture around suspended vegetables and questionable protein combinations, and somehow convinced ourselves this was normal. Public PSA fear tactics. But perhaps our most memorable shared cultural experience was being collectively traumatized by public service announcements that treated us like we were perpetually on the verge of making catastrophically bad decisions. These weren't just educational messages, they were psychological warfare campaigns designed to scare us into compliance through the power of dramatic imagery and ominous narration. "This is your brain on drugs" wasn't just a slogan. It was a cultural moment that united an entire generation in confused terror. We'd be sitting there watching our favorite Saturday morning cartoons when suddenly we'd be confronted with a fried egg sizzling in a pan, representing our supposedly drug-addled brains. The message was clear. Do drugs, become breakfast food. The production values were incredible for what were essentially educational scare tactics. Dramatic music, professional lighting, serious actors delivering lines like they were announcing the end of the world. "Any questions?" the narrator would ask after showing us our hypothetical scrambled brain, as if we were supposed to raise our hands and ask for clarification about the egg metaphor. We'd absorb these messages with the seriousness of people receiving vital survival information. The PSA would end, the cartoons would resume, and we'd sit there slightly traumatized, wondering if we'd ever accidentally consume something that would turn our brains into brunch. The transition from just say no to drugs back to Saturday morning fun with cartoon characters was jarring enough to give us whiplash. The creativity of these fear campaigns was impressive. Drunk driving PSAs featured crashed cars and dramatic hospital scenes. Anti-smoking campaigns showed us lungs that looked like they'd been dipped in tar. We were essentially being educated through controlled trauma, and somehow this was considered effective public policy. And it worked, sort of. We'd walk away from these PSAs with vivid, unforgettable images burned into our memories. We might not have remembered the specific statistics or educational content, but we definitely remembered that eggs could represent our brains and that brains could apparently be cooked. Whether this actually prevented drug use or just created a generation of people with weird anxieties about breakfast food is still unclear. Bike helmets were for losers. Meanwhile, our approach to bicycle safety was based on the sophisticated risk assessment philosophy of, if you can't see the danger, it doesn't exist. Bike helmets weren't just uncool, they were social suicide devices that marked you as someone who was definitely different in all the wrong ways. Real kids didn't need protective gear. Real kids relied on luck, reflexes, and the invincibility that came with being under the age of 16. The few brave souls who did wear helmets faced immediate social consequences. They'd show up to the neighborhood bike gathering wearing their protective gear, and the rest of us would look at them like they'd arrived wearing a full suit of medieval armor. "Why are you wearing that?" we'd ask, as if they'd made some kind of inexplicable fashion choice rather than a sensible safety decision. Parents would watch their children zoom off on bicycles without any protective equipment and somehow conclude that this was normal, healthy, risk-taking behavior. "Be careful!" they'd shout, as if verbal warnings were adequate protection against the laws of physics. The idea that maybe, possibly, we should protect our heads during an activity that involved propelling ourselves at high speeds on two wheels while navigating traffic never seemed to occur to anyone. We'd perform elaborate stunts, race through busy intersections, and attempt jumps that would make professional stunt performers nervous, all while wearing nothing more protective than a baseball cap turned backwards for aerodynamic purposes. The backwards cap was somehow considered adequate head protection, as if the bill of the hat could deflect concrete or asphalt. The peer pressure was intense and completely backwards. Instead of encouraging each other to make smart safety choices, we'd actively discourage anything that resembled responsible behavior. "You don't need a helmet, you're not going to fall," we'd say, as if confidence could overcome gravity and bad judgment could prevent accidents. And when someone did fall, which happened regularly because we were children on bicycles attempting things that defied common sense, we'd treat it like a learning experience rather than a preventable injury. "That's how you learn," we'd say, as if head injuries were valuable educational tools rather than serious medical emergencies that could easily have been prevented with a simple piece of protective equipment. Roller rinks and reverse skate night. But our most gravity-defying social gathering spots had to be those disco ball-lit roller rinks, where we'd spend entire Friday nights attempting to master the art of moving backwards while wearing wheels on our feet. The concept was simple enough. Take a bunch of teenagers who had barely figured out how to walk forward without tripping over their own feet, strap roller skates to them, and then announce over the scratchy PA system, "Now go backwards," like this was completely normal human behavior. The announcement would send a ripple of panic through the rink. Half the kids would immediately grab for the wall like they were about to fall off a cliff, while the other half would attempt to reverse direction with all the grace of a freight train trying to parallel park. We'd windmill our arms, lean at impossible angles, and somehow convince ourselves that we were mastering an essential life skill. The really confident skaters would attempt backwards crossovers, creating elaborate pretzel-like leg movements that defied both physics and common sense. They'd weave through the crowd of backwards beginners like they were navigating a minefield of flailing limbs and questionable balance. Meanwhile, the rest of us would shuffle backwards in tiny, terrified steps, looking like we were performing some kind of slow-motion panic dance. The couple's skate during reverse night was particularly spectacular. Two people who could barely skate backwards individually would somehow decide that holding hands would make the whole process easier. They'd clutch each other with the desperation of people clinging to a life raft, creating a two-person disaster that was twice as likely to end in a tangled heap on the disco ball-lit floor. And when someone inevitably fell, which happened roughly every 30 seconds during reverse night, it would create a domino effect of backward skaters trying to avoid the pileup. We'd scatter like confused bowling pins, arms windmilling, voices squeaking with panic. somehow making the situation infinitely worse by trying to help. But we loved every terrifying minute of it. The DJ would play Celebration by Kool and the Gang, and we'd attempt to skate backwards to the beat, creating a spectacle that was equal parts athletic achievement and public safety hazard. Parents would watch from the sidelines, somehow convinced that this was normal, healthy entertainment rather than a weekly festival of controlled chaos. Encyclopedia Salesmen. Meanwhile, our quest for knowledge required inviting complete strangers into our homes to sell us 400 pounds of information that would become obsolete before we finished paying for it. Encyclopedia salesmen weren't just door-to-door vendors. They were educational evangelists who somehow convinced an entire generation of parents that their children's futures depended on owning a full set of leather-bound books that contained everything anyone could ever want to know about anything. The sales pitch was elaborate and compelling. A well-dressed stranger would appear at your door with a briefcase full of sample volumes and a presentation that made it sound like owning an encyclopedia set was basically equivalent to having a personal university in your living room. Your children will have access to all human knowledge, they'd announce, as if they were offering to install a direct line to the Library of Alexandria. Parents would gather around the coffee table while this stranger opened his sample volumes and began the demonstration. He'd flip through pages of colorful photographs and detailed articles explaining how this investment would give their children an insurmountable advantage in school, in life, in everything. The subtext was clear. Families without encyclopedias were basically condemning their children to a life of ignorance and mediocrity. The financing options were always presented as incredibly reasonable. For just the cost of a cup of coffee per day, they'd say, somehow making a $1,200 investment in books sound like pocket change. They'd pull out calculators and show complex payment plans that made it seem like you were practically making money by buying their encyclopedias. And we'd use them, sort of. They'd sit on their special shelf, looking impressive and scholarly, occasionally consulted for school reports that required book sources. We'd flip through the volumes randomly, reading about topics we'd never heard of and would never need to know about, somehow convinced that this random absorption of information was making us smarter. The tragic irony was that by the time we'd finished paying for these encyclopedias, half the information in them was already outdated. The space program had advanced, countries had changed names, new discoveries had been made, and our expensive knowledge collection was slowly becoming a very heavy set of historical documents rather than current reference materials. Toys with sharp parts. But our most questionable entertainment choices involved toys that were essentially weapons disguised as fun. Lawn darts weren't just outdoor games, they were essentially spears that we hurled through the air with the casual confidence of people who had never heard of liability insurance or emergency room visits. Take a heavy metal dart with a sharp point, throw it as high and as hard as you can, and hope it lands somewhere near the target rather than in someone's skull. The packaging would show happy families gathered around their lawn dart set, smiling as they participated in what was essentially a backyard javelin competition. Fun for the whole family, the box would promise, right next to a product that could easily impale someone if thrown with sufficient enthusiasm. We'd set up the plastic rings on the lawn and take turns hurling these projectiles into the air, somehow convinced that this was normal recreational activity. And parents would watch us play with these things without flinching. They'd see us launching metal spears into the air and think, "Oh, the kids are outside getting exercise and fresh air." The idea that maybe, possibly, we were essentially playing with medieval weapons never seemed to cross anyone's mind. The metal Tonka trucks were equally hazardous in their own way. These weren't the plastic toys of today. These were solid steel constructions that could probably be used as actual construction equipment in a pinch. We'd load them with rocks, crash them into each other, and use them as projectiles in elaborate backyard wars. They had sharp corners, heavy weight, and absolutely no safety features whatsoever. The really adventurous kids would create elaborate stunts with these metal trucks, building ramps out of plywood and launching them across the yard like tiny automotive missiles. We'd gather around these demonstrations with the enthusiasm of people watching professional stunt shows, completely oblivious to the fact that we were essentially creating our own personal demolition derby with toys that could easily cause serious injury. Chemistry sets came with actual chemicals that could create actual explosions if mixed incorrectly. Wood-burning kits gave children access to tools that could easily start fires or create serious burns. We had access to all kinds of potentially dangerous equipment, and somehow this was considered educational rather than hazardous. The general philosophy seemed to be that children would learn important life lessons through trial and error, and if those errors occasionally resulted in minor injuries, well, that was just part of growing up. We were essentially conducting our own safety experiments, and the results were surprisingly successful considering the questionable nature of our equipment. Laser background school photos. But perhaps our most memorable attempts at looking sophisticated involved posing for school pictures in front of backgrounds that looked like they'd been designed by someone who had only heard photography described secondhand. The laser background wasn't just a photo option. It was a statement that said, "I am from the future, and the future is incredibly geometric and unnecessarily colorful." These backgrounds featured swirling neon colors, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, and laser-like streaks that seemed to be shooting from random directions. The more ridiculous the background, the cooler you were. A simple blue backdrop was for amateurs. Real style required backgrounds that looked like they'd been created during a collision between a rainbow and a laser light show. We'd stand in front of these psychedelic masterpieces, wearing our best outfits, trying to look natural while surrounded by colors that didn't exist in nature. The photographer would position us carefully, making sure we were properly framed against the neon chaos behind us. "Look natural," they'd say, as if anyone could look natural while posing in front of what appeared to be an electronic kaleidoscope having a breakdown. The portrait packages would arrive weeks later, and we'd eagerly examine our photos to see how we looked against our chosen laser wonderland. Parents would display these pictures with pride, as if the laser background somehow elevated the artistic quality of the portrait. "Look how creative Sarah's school picture is this year," they'd say, showing off a photo that looked like it had been taken inside a malfunctioning computer. The variety of laser backgrounds was impressive in its commitment to complete visual chaos. Some featured geometric shapes that seemed to be exploding in all directions. Others had wavy lines that looked like they were documenting some kind of seismic event. The most popular ones combined multiple laser effects, creating backgrounds that were essentially visual assaults disguised as photography enhancements. We'd compare our laser backgrounds like we were comparing artistic masterpieces. "I got the one with the purple spirals and the green zigzags," we'd announce proudly, as if we'd made some kind of sophisticated aesthetic choice rather than selecting the most visually overwhelming option available. The laser background was our way of ensuring that our school photos would be impossible to ignore, even if they were also impossible to look at for extended periods. Slap bracelets that hurt. But our most masochistic fashion accessory had to be those slap bracelets that were essentially self-inflicted punishment disguised as jewelry. These weren't just accessories. They were spring-loaded torture devices that we willingly applied to our own wrists with the dedication of people who had somehow convinced themselves that pain was fashionable. The concept was brilliantly simple and completely insane. take a flexible metal strip, cover it with fabric, and create a bracelet that would snap around your wrist with enough force to leave marks. The satisfying slap sound was apparently worth the temporary welts and the lingering sting that followed each application. We'd demonstrate them to each other like we were showing off some kind of advanced technology rather than a device designed to inflict minor wrist injuries. The demonstration ritual was elaborate and slightly sadistic. You'd hold the bracelet straight, show it to your friends, and then, with dramatic flair, slap it against your wrist where it would curl around with surprising force. The louder the slap, the more impressive the bracelet. We'd rate them based on their snapping intensity, somehow concluding that the ones that hurt the most were obviously the highest quality. Teachers would confiscate these things like they were weapons, which, let's be honest, they kind of were. A good slap bracelet could leave a red mark that lasted for hours, and we'd wear these marks like badges of honor. "Look at my slap bracelet mark," we'd announce proudly, showing off what was essentially evidence of self-inflicted minor assault. The fabric covering would inevitably wear off, revealing the sharp metal underneath that was responsible for the bracelet's snapping action. At this point, a reasonable person might conclude that the bracelet had become too dangerous to wear. We, however, would continue wearing them, metal edges and all, somehow convinced that exposed sharp metal made them even cooler. We'd collect them in different colors and patterns, building entire collections of these wrist-attacking accessories. The more slap bracelets you owned, the more fashion-forward you were considered to be. We'd layer them up our arms like colorful, painful armor, creating a percussion section wherever we walked as they clicked and slapped against each other. The social aspect was the strangest part. We'd slap each other's bracelets onto our wrists, sharing the pain like it was some kind of bonding experience. "Here, try my new one," we'd say, offering our friends the opportunity to experience whatever new level of wrist discomfort we'd discovered. Somehow, this passed for normal social interaction rather than group participation in voluntary minor injury. High hair and more hairspray than oxygen. But our most environmentally hazardous beauty trend had to be our commitment to hairstyles that required their own zip codes and enough aerosol products to damage the ozone layer single-handedly. High hair wasn't just a fashion statement. It was an architectural achievement that defied gravity, weather, and common sense. We'd spend hours each morning constructing elaborate hair sculptures that could probably survive natural disasters, using enough hairspray to create our own personal atmospheric pollution. The aquanet cloud that surrounded us was probably flammable. We'd stand in front of bathroom mirrors, holding cans of hairspray like we were operating industrial equipment, creating toxic fog banks that would make environmental scientists weep. The bathroom would fill with a haze so thick you could barely see your reflection, but somehow this seemed like a reasonable price to pay for hair that could withstand hurricane-force winds. The construction process was elaborate and time-consuming. First, you'd tease your hair with a brush until it achieved maximum volume, creating a foundation that looked like you'd stuck your finger in an electrical socket. Then came the hairspray, layer upon layer of aerosol chemicals that would lock this gravity-defying structure into place. We'd spray, tease, spray again, add more volume, and spray some more, creating hairstyles that were essentially chemical sculptures. The final result was hair that moved as one solid unit. A gentle breeze that would normally cause individual strands to flutter would instead cause our entire hairstyle to pivot, like a satellite dish adjusting for better reception. We'd achieved hair that was less organic material and more architectural marvel, held together by enough chemicals to preserve it for archaeological study. The maintenance was constant and expensive. We'd go through cans of hairspray like they were consumable goods, restocking our bathroom supplies like we were running a small chemical factory. Parents would wonder why the grocery bill included so many aerosol products, never quite connecting the dots between their teenagers' towering hairstyle and the depletion of atmospheric gases. And we'd sleep on this creation, carefully positioning our heads on pillows in ways that wouldn't disturb the chemical architecture we'd spent hours perfecting. Morning hair maintenance involved touching up the structure rather than starting over, adding fresh layers of hairspray to reinforce any areas that had been compromised during the night. We were essentially performing daily engineering maintenance on our own heads. Punch Buggy games. Meanwhile, our family road trip entertainment involved systematically assaulting each other at the sight of specific automotive models. The punch buggy game wasn't just a car-spotting activity. It was a legitimized violence system that turned every family car ride into a low-level combat situation. The rules were simple. Spot a Volkswagen Beetle, punch your sibling, and shout, "Punch Buggy," as if this somehow justified the assault. Parents would listen to the rhythmic thumping and occasional yelps from the back seat, and somehow conclude that this was normal, healthy sibling interaction. "Oh, they're just playing punch buggy," they'd say, as if this explained why their children were systematically bruising each other during what was supposed to be a peaceful family outing. The strategic element was intense. We'd scan the roadways like air traffic controllers, searching for those distinctive rounded shapes that would give us permission to inflict minor bodily harm on our siblings. The anticipation was constant. You never knew when someone might spot a beetle and launch a surprise attack. Every family car ride became a low-level anxiety experience punctuated by sudden violence. The punch delivery was surprisingly sophisticated. There were rules about which body parts were acceptable targets, how hard you could hit, and what constituted a legitimate beetle sighting. We'd develop complex techniques for maximizing impact while staying within the unwritten punch buggy regulations. Some kids perfected the surprise attack, while others favored the dramatic wind-up that gave their victims a moment of terror before impact. The disputes were constant and heated. "That's not a real beetle." "You already called that one." "No punchbacks." We'd argue about the legitimacy of sightings with the intensity of Supreme Court justices debating constitutional law. Parents would be forced to arbitrate these disputes, somehow finding themselves in the position of regulating a violence-based car game they'd never officially approved. And the game would continue for hours, turning long car rides into endurance contests of vigilance and pain tolerance. We'd arrive at our destinations with sore arms and heightened awareness of Volkswagen's market presence. Somehow convinced that we'd spent the journey engaged in wholesome family entertainment rather than participating in a mobile assault festival. People thought MSG was the devil. But our most contradictory health panic involved developing an elaborate fear of monosodium glutamate while simultaneously consuming foods that were essentially edible chemistry experiments. MSG became the villain of 1980s dining, the mysterious chemical additive that was supposedly responsible for everything from headaches to heart palpitations. We'd scrutinize restaurant menus and food labels with the dedication of people avoiding actual poison, completely oblivious to the fact that we were washing down our MSG-free meals with bright orange cheese powder and artificially flavored everything. The MSG hysteria was everywhere. Restaurants would advertise, "No MSG," like they were promoting some kind of health breakthrough. We'd avoid Chinese restaurants that admitted to using MSG while happily consuming snack foods that contained ingredients with names that sounded like they belonged in a chemistry textbook. The hypocrisy was spectacular and completely invisible to us. Meanwhile, we'd eat Cheetos with the confidence of people consuming health food, never questioning why our fingers turned radioactive orange, or why the cheese powder seemed to defy the laws of nature by sticking to everything it touched. The ingredient list on these snacks read like a graduate-level chemistry exam, but somehow this was considered perfectly safe, while MSG was treated like a controlled substance. The Doritos situation was particularly absurd. We'd crunch our way through bags of corn chips covered in flavor dust that contained more artificial ingredients than a laboratory supply catalog, washing them down with artificially colored and flavored soft drinks, all while carefully avoiding restaurants that might contaminate our meals with MSG. The cognitive dissonance was impressive. Our parents would stock pantries with processed foods that contained preservatives, artificial colors, artificial flavors, and chemical stabilizers with names that required advanced degrees to pronounce. But they'd specifically seek out products that were proudly MSG-free. The shopping logic was, mysterious chemical additives were fine as long as they weren't specifically monosodium glutamate. We'd eat TV dinners that contained enough sodium to preserve meat for decades, snack on chips that were essentially flavored cardboard covered in chemical dust, and drink sodas that were basically liquid candy with added caffeine, all while maintaining our vigilant stance against the terrible dangers of MSG. The health priorities were confused at best and completely backwards at worst. Movie ratings that meant nothing. But our most meaningless consumer protection system had to be those movie ratings that provided absolutely no reliable information about what you were about to watch. PG didn't mean parental guidance. It meant prepare for anything, because you might encounter blood, smoking, drinking, swearing, and violence that would make modern audiences demand refunds and write strongly worded letters to theater managers. The rating system was essentially a suggestion rather than a reliable guide. A PG movie might feature extended scenes of characters smoking cigarettes like they were essential life support equipment, consuming alcohol with the dedication of people treating it as a food group, and engaging in activities that would easily earn an R rating by today's standards. But somehow, this was considered appropriate for general audiences, including small children. Parents would drop kids off at the theater for PG movies with the confidence of people who had thoroughly researched the content. "It's PG, so it must be fine," they'd say, somehow trusting that this single-letter designation guaranteed wholesome, family-friendly entertainment. They'd return hours later to pick up children who had been exposed to enough questionable content to require therapy. The violence in PG movies was particularly surprising. Characters would engage in elaborate fight scenes, experience dramatic injuries, and participate in activities that would make modern safety experts demand immediate intervention. But as long as the blood wasn't too graphic and the language wasn't too colorful, apparently it was suitable for audiences of all ages. The smoking situation was absolutely ridiculous. PG movies would feature characters chain-smoking their way through entire scenes, treating cigarettes like essential props rather than health hazards. We'd watch our favorite characters puff away with the dedication of people who had never heard of lung cancer, somehow absorbing the message that smoking was sophisticated adult behavior rather than a dangerous addiction. And the language! PG movies would feature swearing that would make modern audiences check their tickets to make sure they hadn't wandered into the wrong theater. Characters would unleash strings of profanity that would earn immediate R ratings today, but somehow this was considered appropriate for general audiences as long as they didn't say the really bad words too many times. Video store rewind rules. But perhaps our most ridiculous consumer responsibility involved the elaborate social contract surrounding VHS tape maintenance. Video store rewind rules weren't just suggestions, they were moral obligations that carried serious social and financial consequences. Forget to rewind your rental, and you'd face both public shaming and actual monetary penalties. The 50-cent fine wasn't just about the money. It was about your character as a human being. The Be Kind Rewind signs were everywhere, posted like commandments that governed the sacred relationship between customer and video store. These weren't just polite requests. They were fundamental principles of civilized society. A person who returned an unrewound video was essentially announcing to the world that they were inconsiderate, lazy, and probably couldn't be trusted with other basic social responsibilities. The rewinding process itself was elaborate and time-consuming. You'd finish watching your movie, eject the tape, and then spend several minutes watching it, slowly wind backwards, listening to the mechanical whirring that meant you were fulfilling your civic duty. Some people would start rewinding during the credits, trying to optimize their time management while still meeting their rewinding obligations. The really organized families would have dedicated rewinding schedules. Someone would be assigned VHS maintenance duty, responsible for ensuring that all rental tapes were properly rewound before the return deadline. This was serious business that required planning, attention to detail, and a commitment to community standards that went beyond mere entertainment consumption. The shame of receiving a rewind fee was intense and public. The video store clerk would hold up your unrewound tape like evidence of moral failure, announcing your 50-cent penalty loud enough for other customers to hear. You'd stand there, exposed as someone who couldn't be bothered to complete the simple task of rewinding, while other customers shook their heads in disapproval. And we accepted this system completely. The idea that maybe, possibly, the video store could handle the rewinding process themselves never occurred to us. We'd developed an entire social structure around customer-managed tape maintenance, creating a system where entertainment came with homework assignments and moral obligations that extended well beyond the actual viewing experience. So, there you have it, the 1980s in all their gloriously ridiculous detail. We survived it all, somehow convinced every step of the way that we were living in the height of sophistication rather than participating in one of history's most elaborate collective experiments in questionable decision-making.